So let's pick up where we left off this morning. So beginning with Matt's voice. Matt, what do you notice? Seán, there's a new level to lightness of being. It feels like dimension by dimension, level by level, the heaviness is falling away and the kind of attachments dissolve. Matt, what do you see? Seán, right now, I see an ocean scenario of dolphins cavorting and playing and sporting with each other. And I'm sitting on a beach again for a few moments, just watching them. And then I realize it's a soul group in disguise playing. And now they're going to come ashore in a guise in which I would recognize them. And we're going to have a party on the beach. Matt, describe them to me as if they're forming a semicircle, like numbers on a clock from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. Seán, I see the two ends, the 9 o'clock and the 3 o'clock positions, between which everybody else is standing. In the 9 o'clock and the 3 o'clock positions, I see two whom I've met before. My great-grandmother in the Seán lifetime and my grandfather in the Seán lifetime. They're creating a kind of a sandwich for the whole group. My great-grandmother is at the 9 o'clock and my grandfather at the 3 o'clock. We three have been together in many lifetimes. And at the 12 o'clock position, I see the soul that is now Ireland. I see my nephew, Seán Og, at about 1 o'clock, and my sister Ethna, who died of a brain aneurysm 11 years ago in this lifetime, at the 11 o'clock position. And I see my brother Seamus, Seán Og's father, next to Ethna around the 10 o'clock. That's the group. Matt, anybody behind you? Seán, yes, there's somebody behind me. A man called Eamon Hayden, who was my spiritual director in the seminary and a friend for many years since. Matt, what do you want to do with this group? Seán, what I want to do is to invite them all to shed the costumes so that I can meet their essences. Matt, do you have a sense what roles these people may have played in the last lifetime as a soldier? Seán, Arlen obviously played a key role in that. I think Eamon actually may have been my commanding officer. Yeah, Ethna was there. Ethna, I think, was also in the concentration camp. I didn't see her that day, but she was there. Matt, she was there with Arlen. Seán, she was in that concentration camp, but I didn't see her. Matt, is there somebody who feels like your soulmate? Seán, yes, Arlen. Matt, tell us about your great-grandmother. Seán, I feel like my great-grandmother, in many lifetimes, has represented the ability to extract spirituality from religion, which is a major operation a lot of the time, it seems to me. That in many lifetimes, while being a devotee of a particular system, she has always managed to go to the spiritual core of it. And the lifetimes I've shared with her, she has really, really helped me and inspired me. You feel a shared experience? That was Matt. Seán, yeah. And with this ability, I think she has helped me realize that for all its ignorance and elitism and dogmatic assertions, that many religious systems have a core of spirituality. And that if you can forgive it, its trespasses, you can mine it for its interiority. Matt, and what of your grandfather? Seán, yeah. My grandfather has played a complementary role to that. He's always been a kind of a druidical pagan figure in the sense of being unconventional and having the courage to stand up against systems, even powerful systems, and to stand in integrity. And it feels like it's not either or, but both and. That there's a time to challenge and stand strong and confront particularly oppressive institutions. And there's a time to extract, even from institutions, whatever nuggets of truth they contain. And I feel that is the reason that they're at the two ends of the semicircle, that they represent the ability to extract from even the most unnutritious of foods something that will nourish us, and at the same time try to stand up against and confront and challenge that which oppresses and enslaves. Matt, have you been a priest before? Seán? Yeah. From this place, it feels that in several incarnations, I have been in the role of a priest or a monk. And sometimes I've pretty much kowtowed to the system, but mostly I found myself at variance with it, mostly with disastrous consequences. And it feels as if their twin energies have allowed me to see what's of value and confront what's not true. Matt, what else do you feel? Seán, from Eamon, who stands behind me, Eamon is a kind of a real, he plays by the rules and he's a good soldier and he takes orders, but he's a deeply spiritual man as well. So he and my great-grandmother have the same kind of energy. Eamon would never buck the system, but he's still very forgiving and loving and accepting of those who do. And he is really faithful to his own spiritual practice. He's not the kind of person who takes chances and does wild things in any facet of his life. He's dependable, loyal, truthful, compassionate. And so what I learned from him is to not judge the members according to the organization. That even the most corrupt of institutions are often peopled by really compassionate, loving, loyal individuals. And that I should be able to see that in them and respond to that part of them. So there's lots of complementarity there, because Arlen, who's straight ahead of me, represents the opposite view to that. She really calls a spade and doesn't have a whole lot of toleration for bullshit or made up kinds of beliefs. When I look at her, I feel that she has been a really great teacher for me. That the very differences between us and the fact that we have so often encountered each other during incarnation from opposing camps, that she really forced me to think. She's really forced me to examine the particular prejudices of whatever organization I found myself in, and try to step outside the boxes and the categories and free myself. So I've never felt like stepping into her prejudices, but I've been challenged to step out of my own. Matt, do you feel like she's been a teacher for you? Seán, yeah, I do. I feel like particularly she has challenged me to see the beauty and the core of non-human sentient beings, animals. Matt, what about your nephew? Seán, yeah, Seán Og is there, my nephew, and he's a beautiful spirit. And part of what I want to say to him particularly is my prayer for him is that he believe in himself much more deeply than he does during incarnation. Matt, is it good to be there? Seán, it's great to be with them, yeah. It's interesting. I feel that Ethna and Seán Og, that their real gift and what they've come to bring in many lifetimes is the gift of healing. Sometimes in informal setting and sometimes in more formal settings, that they bring real healing energies into groups. Matt, are you grateful for them? Seán, very grateful for them. And Seamus, my brother, Seán Og's father, a man of very few words this time. And the most soulful eyes of anybody I've ever met. Extraordinary loyalty. He is like the quiet energy and strength behind many groups of which he's a part, taking credit for none of it. Matt, do you think there's more to do here? Seán, I think we can leave this group. I want to give each of them a hug first and then tell them if they want to pretend to be dolphins again, that's okay with me. So we've got an extended period at this stage now. We've got 2 hours for this session, so we can really get into stuff, much wherever you're interested in whatever questions that come up. So Mike's question is, that he noticed that the people in my soul group that I mentioned are all people who have been part of this incarnation as Seán. And he's wondering, what does that say about time and the illusion of time? So it's a great question, Mike. And that's why on the first night, last night, in the first session, I wanted to emphasize the energy exchange between the incarnated and the disincarnate, that every single one of us, including Mike Hughes, that the vast bulk of your soul self is at source, yeah? And as a part of it, committed to this incarnation as Mike Hughes, and possibly parts of that soul committed to parallel lifetimes, elsewhere, but all out of time. Because as I keep saying, time is an illusion created by incarnation, that there are 4 limitations that we willingly accept when we volunteer for incarnation. And the first one is that we who are literally cosmic beings are now confined to these tiny little spacesuits, so that the sense of diminishment, the spatial diminishment is huge. And that's the first one that we experience, the first limitation. And that the second one is that we are literally holographic fractals of source. And a hologram, as you well know, is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And we're fractals. A fractal is a pattern that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So as holographic fractals of source, we're all God, we're all divine. And so in that sense, we're completely out of time and we're totally in touch with everything, all that is. But that when we volunteer for incarnation, we set aside that omniscience and we adopt this tiny little brain that's so kind of small that it can only process little pieces at a time. And so if we came in here with full divine consciousness, we could process the entire gestalt of the human race. But we can't do that because of this little piece of equipment up here. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces. It's the same way that if you had a book, that you can download in 10 seconds from Amazon, and it's going to take me a week to read it. So I'm going to have to process it page by page, paragraph by paragraph, line by line, word by word. But all of the information is contained there. So if I had a different kind of a brain, I could just suck all the data down. And that's part of what people in near-death experiences constantly say, that they get downloads of information and that they get the answers to all the questions that have ever been asked by humanity. And these are people who are just, farmers who are getting downloads about quantum mechanics and understanding the answers they're getting. And so there's complete download of data. Now, so the third limitation then is that because we have these very small brains, we have to break up the gestalt of our experiences into bite-sized pieces and thus process them sequentially, giving rise to the illusion of time. And then the fourth one is that where we suffer amnesia for who we really are and why we've come. And there's a great Jewish myth about an angel called Ayala, and that before a baby is born, the angel pinches the baby's nostrils and puts a mark on the upper lip. And that's why you've got an indentation here and at the sides of your nose. And that's to create amnesia for everything you've ever learned at the other side. Because part of the journey is to experience separation as completely as possible. And in the middle of that separation, to see, is there some way I can still remember who I am and reconnect with the divine? And so these characters then that I mentioned in this, in the soul group, these are all people, most of whose energy is still at the other side, some of whose energy is still on this side, but that all of us, in fact, have shared energy on both sides of the veil. So in the Celtic system, we talk about the ÓLaoire, the thin place where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is diaphanous and where you can see through it. And that's the function of a visionary or a prophet or a shaman, is to be able to kind of pierce the veil on a regular basis, and receive information. And that the function of the shaman is to kind of receive visions on behalf of the tribe, not just on their personal behalf. And so that these are characters that I've shared many, many incarnations with, and not just this particular incarnation as the Seán self, and that therefore they just disguise them. Their essences disguise themselves. I wanted to know their essences. So it was fun to me that I'm watching a bunch of dolphins just cavorting, like in Maria del Mar. When we go down to the ocean, we see all these dolphins cavorting. I'm just watching a bunch of dolphins. I'm sitting on the beach watching. And I suddenly get it. It's my soul pod just playing a trick on me. They're disguising, So they could now appear, as people I recognize from my Seán life, but I wasn't happy with that. I wanted them to appear in their essence. I didn't want to just to identify them with their spacesuits from this incarnation, and that's exactly what they did. And so I've identified them as my sister or my brother or my nephew or my soulmate, but in actual fact, I'm in contact with and I'm engaged with the essences, the spirit, soul essence of that. So the shapes, and the configurations are just a game that we play. And I wanted to see beyond the game, wanted to be in contact with their soul selves, their essences. But for purposes of reporting that back to Matt at the other side, I had to give him some kind of data which is meaningful at this side of it. So it's like I'm watching the Super Bowl and then having to at the same time to talk into a phone and try to describe something and put images to stuff. And so that's my sense then, that they're all people with whom I've shared many incarnations. And I didn't want to kind of just stick with the spacesuits in which I most currently kind of encounter them, but I wanted to be in contact with the essence, and that's indeed what happened in the session. So Amy's question is brilliant. It's about our connection to non-human sentient beings and whether or not it is possible to find such in a soul pod. And you're absolutely right on. So the interesting thing to me is that soul pods exist in concentric circles. It's like you throw a little pebble into a still pond and it ripples out. And no matter what the kind of the irregularity of the perimeter of the pond is, every single part of the perimeter is going to experience the ripples at some stage. So the core of this soul pod for me is the soul mate. That in Gaelic we have the term anamachara, and anamachara in Gaelic means a soul friend. It does not necessarily mean a romantic partner or a sexual partner. It could be a brother or a sister. It could be a parent. So that there's a core, where the pebble actually first hits the pond is the kind of the soulmate, what Ireland would call the Besharta, and what I would call in Gaelic anamachara. And so that's the first level of the soul pod. And then as it ripples out, there's going to be like the group I encountered You know, in this journey, there were family members and there was a non-family member. And so that's the next level out. People who have been together in many different incarnations, playing many different roles and many different kinds of relationships with each other, sometimes as siblings, sometimes as parents, sometimes as spiritual directors, whatever. So that's the next level of the concentric circles of the ripples. And then around that, maybe the kind of the larger family or the extended family, and then the tribal group, and then the culture, and then the nation, and then the human species, and then all sentient beings on planet Earth, and then all sentient beings throughout the galaxy, and then all sentient beings throughout our, you know, our very cosmos. And that some souls will want to incarnate and have experiences in very different life forms. So I'll talk some tomorrow about those who go to more exotic kinds of dimensions. But to answer to your specific question now, there are some souls who volunteer in this incarnation to be your pet dog, or your cat, or your bunny rabbit, or your hamster, or the oak tree in your back garden, you know, or your favorite rock that you like to sit on. I've got a place called Meditation Rock where I live and watch the sunset. And so I wrote a poem many, many, many years ago, even before this experience, where I looked at various evolutionary kinds of experiences I've had as a soul, starting off literally as a rock, experiencing life as a rock. What is it like to be a rock? You know, to be the recipient of rain and wind and storms and earthquakes and volcanoes. What is it like to be a single-celled organism? What was it like to be a flower opening to the sun like our California poppies? What was it like to be a bunny rabbit? And so I walked myself through a whole series of incarnational experiences where I wanted to experience what it's like to be in that particular configuration, you know, as a receptacle for experiencing on behalf of Source itself. And so, yes, and you find in the near-death experience literature that very, very often one of the first to meet you at the other side after the ending of a particular incarnation is a pet that you've had, you know, in this lifetime. So there's a great story in the Hindu tradition about Arjuna. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there's this great story of the great battle where Arjuna has to fight his own cousins. And he's got two brothers, and the brothers are killed before he is. And finally, Arjuna himself dies, and he kind of approaches what in Christianity we call the pearly gates. And he comes to the gates, and he has a look inside, and he can't see his brothers. And he asks the Saint Peter of Hinduism, "Where are my brothers?" And he said, "Sorry, your brothers didn't make it. They're not here." And Arjuna says, "Well, if my brothers aren't there, that's not the place for me." And he turns around. And St. Peter says to him, "Only joking. We just wanted to test your faith. We wanted to know whether your own personal kind of salvation is more important to you than family members. Here they are. Hey!" And they come and they greet you. And then Arjuna says, "Okay." And he goes in and he says, "Where's my dog?" And Peter says to him, "Dog? There's no dogs allowed in heaven." And Arjuna says, "Well, this dog has been my faithful companion for a lot of my life. If dogs aren't allowed into heaven, heaven is not the place for me." And he turns around again. And Peter says to him, "Only joking. I was finally testing you. We want to see if your love for kind of other animals is as strong as yourself, or your sense of wanting to protect yourself. Here's your dog." And there comes wagging his tail. And Arjuna finally agrees to go into heaven. And so this notion that we're only separated from everything else in the kind of the physical realms by the level of self-awareness that each manifestation accepts for a particular incarnation. So the only thing that separates you from a rock is the level of self-awareness. A rock doesn't have that much self-awareness as a rock, but it volunteered to be a rock in order to kind of be, you know, experience what it's like to have that low level of self-awareness and to be just kind of having to respond to kind of environmental conditions. And so the differences then as we go up, say, from single-cell creatures to multicellular organisms, to kind of animal, to flora, to fauna, to Homo sapiens sapiens, you know, the level of self-awareness increases in the particular spacesuit in which it finds itself, until finally, you know, a totally self-aware being. In Hinduism, they'll call it a self-realized. And self-realization is a very interesting term because, to realize has two very different meanings. To realize means to kind of get it cognitively. Oh, I just realized it's 3 o'clock or whatever. So to realize means to get it cognitively, but it also means to make real, to bring something into reality. And so self-realization is not about just reckoning, oh my God, I'm God, and everything else is God, but actually to make it real in your life and to act from the knowledge that you are indeed divine and that everything you encounter is divine. And so for the purposes of incarnation, we agree to limitations of various kinds of self-realization or self-awareness. But that's for the purposes just of experiencing what is it like when there's little self-awareness of our inner divinity. How do we manage in those kinds of circumstances? And how do we manage to mine even that for progress? But it's a self-appointed kind of a sense of purpose and mission, because everything really is God. That I keep saying that life is a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having. So ultimately, we live within nested dreams. It's like, Russian dolls, dolls within dolls within dolls within dolls. And that ultimately we get it, that it is God, having all of these experiences. And that in some senses, we are the way in which God experiences. Because if you take a kind of a Christian notion of God, that there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and that, God is the isness of reality, and the Son is God's total self-knowledge, and the Spirit is the love that God has for whom she knows herself to be. And you get the very same thing in Hinduism. So what tried to put it? Sat, Chit, Ananda. In Hinduism, Sat is being, Chit is self-knowledge, and Ananda is bliss. So this notion that there is being, self-knowledge, and then bliss, in that sense, that's a closed system. It can't generate experiences outside of that unless it self-fractures. So it self-fractures into a myriad of what we call souls. Netzotzim is the Hebrew term for it. And that is the way that God garners experiences. Everything literally from a rock to an avatar is a modality in which God is experiencing. So there's no greater or lesser. There's no hierarchy whatsoever in that system. There's just volunteering for different missions to afford God the optimum level of experience. And so Elizabeth is asking basically two kinds of questions. The first one is that in the process of the induction, as I'm going into a deep hypnotic trance under the baton of Matt McKay, whether or not I experienced any fear during that process. And the second one then is that it appears that I was surrounded with a soul pod that were advanced, souls, and so was there any evil around, or is that always the way it is? So let me break it into those two pieces. So the first thing is I had zero fear whatsoever, not just because I know Matt and I trust Matt completely, but that I have done a lot of, I've been meditating since I was 18. So it's basically 60 years of meditation with many kind of visionary experiences. And I've been collecting my dreams since 1979. So I've had a lot of kind of exposure to that. And I've done, since I learned hypnosis, I've done a lot of self-hypnosis over those years as well. So this is an arena with which I'm really, really familiar. So for all of those reasons, it didn't even occur to me to be afraid or to be anxious about the process. Yeah. The second part of your question then is about, it appears that this was a very, advanced soul pod. So one of my belief systems is that when we're creating what I call a preconception contract, and we're determining, where to land, into which family, which culture, at which stage of human history, that we draw from two different pods. And I call one of them the soul pod, and the other one I call the shadow pod. So we draw people from the shadow pod who are going to make life difficult for us, in this lifetime. And that's their function. Now, so we have in our lives two kinds of people. I call one group the fertilizers and the other the weeders. And the weeders are really important. And so I use, as an example, during all of my time in Kenya, I worked with 3 tribes, 3 Kalenjin peoples, who had been nomadic pastoralists for thousands of years. But when Kenya got its independence on the 12th of December in 1963, the government was forcibly settling these nomadic peoples into an agricultural lifestyle for which they had no experience whatsoever. Now, I'm literally on the equator. I literally crossed the equator several times a day where I lived in East Africa and Kenya. And it's a very arid area, semi-desert area. And we got rain in July and August every year. And then for the rest of the year, we had temperatures like 124 degrees Fahrenheit. And so now I'm both the priest there and I'm also the agricultural instructor. And I'm trying to figure out a system of agriculture that will be simple enough to be able to feed people, given that we really only have 2 months of rain. So we started working with planting maize. And we developed a very simple little system where a team of 4 family members would go out together, walking behind each other in a line. And the first person had a stick with a point into it and would just jab a hole every 6 inches in the ground. And the second person would have a bag of maize kernels, what we call corn off the cob, and take 2 kernels and put it in 2 into each hole in case one failed. And the third person, if the family could afford it, and not every family could, would have a bag of artificial fertilizer, powdered fertilizer, and a spoon, and would take a spoon of fertilizer and put it in on each hole. And then the fourth person would come along with their foot and just cover up the hole, and they'd walk behind each other. And after about 6 weeks, because of the rain, the young maize would be like a foot high. And then they'd go out and they'd weed it. And then after 2 months, it would be like 3 feet high, and they'd go weed it again. And then at the end of 3 months, they'd harvest it. And I would bring them in for seminars, and I would say to them, if for some reason you had to choose between fertilizing and weeding, and you want to optimize your crop, which is the more important, the fertilizing or the weeding? And for the first few years, they were just guessing. But afterwards, they always got the right answer. If you want to optimize your crop and you have to choose between weeding and fertilizing, weeding is far more important than fertilizing, because fertilizer is blind. You put fertilizer down, it'll give growth to everything, grasses and the weeds and everything. It'll be chaotic. It'll be like a jungle there. You'll get almost no maize. If you don't fertilize, but you do weed, you'll get a better crop. And obviously, if you can do both, you'll get the optimal crop. And I would say to them, that is what Christ meant when he said, love your enemies. He's not saying to you, lie down and let people walk all over you. He's not saying that. He's saying that there are people in your life who are weeders, and they're going to point out your inadequacies. And even if they exaggerate them wildly, and even if they take great pleasure in downing you, they're performing a function. And so, listen, you don't have to believe them, or you don't have to go along completely with them, but they're seeing something in you that the fertilizers won't see. So if I only have fertilizers in my life, I become a narcissist. If I only have weeders in my life, I'm paranoid. And so we have this distribution of weeders and fertilizers. So then, as we're planning an incarnation, we choose members from a different pod that are going to act as weeders in our life. And they're signing up then to make life difficult for me. And I'm part of a weeder group for another group. I'm a weeder for some people. I'm a fertilizer for some people. And I can certainly say in my life as a priest, I've proven to be, the source of a lot of unhappiness for people in my life, particularly church people who've been really upset with me for the things I've said, and the positions I've taken. So I've experienced weeders in my life, and I've been a weeder in other people's lives. And so it's very important to realize then that as we're drawing members, that there's both a soul pod and what I call a shadow pod. And we're going to encounter these shadow pod people on a regular basis throughout life. And some of them they may even be family members. And some of them will be local people. And some of them will be kind of international figures, but they have an influence, and they're causing me to stretch and to grow. So that's the response I'd give Elizabeth. So Andrea's questions have to do, firstly, with the notion of separation, and why we would kind of agree to separation from source in order to experience that level of kind of distress. What I'd say about that. And the second one is about recording my dreams. And Andrea's talking about what happens when we have upsetting dreams. What is the function of upsetting dreams? Two great questions, Andrea. So the first one is that this separation anxiety, and it's very part, if you know anything about child psychology, it's a major issue for a newborn child. Separation anxiety, and it comes from the fact that I believe that we're only born with two emotions, the emotion of fear and the emotion of love. And then when fear is kind of self-directed, it becomes poor self-esteem. And when it's other-directed, it becomes anger. When love is self-directed, it becomes, a good impression to myself, the realization I'm a godchild. And when love is other-directed, it becomes compassion. And then these four pieces combine, in various ways. And all of the other virtues and vices are simply permutations and combinations of these two. Now, what happens with an infant and a newborn? A newborn is born as a complete narcissist, and it is necessary that it be so, because the child is utterly dependent on the environment and on the mother particularly for survival, literally for survival. And so the child has to be a complete narcissist. So for about the first 8 months of a child's life, the child lives in what's called in psychology the mother-child complex. The child believes completely there is only one unit here, and I'm in charge of this unit. I scream and a breast arrives, I'm cold and somebody cuddles me. And so the child is totally convinced for the first 7 or 8 months that it's in charge of a unitary phenomenon called the mother-child complex in psychology. Around the age of 8 months, a child begins to develop an ego, a sense of separate self. And now all hell breaks loose, because the child now realizes it's not just one of us, there's two of us, and all the power is on the other side. Mother can walk away. At that stage, I have no power in the situation. So I have to develop defense mechanisms to try to level the playing field. And so one child is going to, be a smiler and a cuddler and kind of try to woo mommy by being so loving and whatever. So mommy will come back and love me anyway. And another one will just scream his bloody head off to force mommy to come back. So we're going to adopt a whole bunch of defense mechanisms. And you see this right throughout our lives then, right into school situations where one kid decides to be the class clown to somehow get attention. The other kid wants to be the jock, the quarterback in the football team to get attention. The other one wants to be kind of the cheerleader to get attention. The other one wants to be the kind of the homecoming queen to get attention. So we develop all these defense mechanisms to try to force the world to love us. Because the deepest fear of all is not just the fear of being unloved. It is the fear of being unlovable. And there's a huge difference. So the little infant with the evolution of the ego has this extraordinary feeling, I realize now there's not just one of us, there are two of us, and she's God, and she's rejecting me. So it's not just that I'm unloved by God, it's that I'm unlovable. If God can't love me, who's going to love me? And that's the deepest fear that we have. Now, that's the fear then is called anxiety separation. Such a child doesn't want to go to school the first day. Mother takes it to school and the child screams and hanging onto her skirts and doesn't want to go to school. So it's a kind of a separation anxiety. Now, to plumb that, there's the great story in one of the Catholic creedal formulations called the Apostles' Creed, where it says that after he died, Jesus descended into hell. And he's in hell for 3 days. And then resurrects on Easter Sunday. And I've thought a lot about what does it mean that Jesus ascended into hell? And for me, it means this, that Jesus was prepared to enter the densest, most separated, darkest, rejected experience of not being connected to Source. He literally plumbed the very, very depths of it. Not only did he come down to a three-dimensional reality of being locked into a little spacesuit with a tiny little brain and being kind of crucified, but he went even deeper. He plumbed the very depths of darkness and density and separation from God. And still remembered who he was. So the separation is an opportunity. It's not just a test as if God is this kind of disinterested entity, just kind of setting kind of end of term examinations, but that God is allowing us to test ourselves to find out just how much separation, just how much density, just how much darkness, just how much pain, just how much sadness you can experience. And still remember that you're God. That you never were anything except God. and that you can never be anything except God. The second part of your question, Andrea, was about dreams and kind of harvesting dreams. So part of the reason why we're experiencing kind of upsetting dreams for me, against it's multimodal. Part of it is that, you know, we've all had experiences during life of various kinds of sufferings, and we have various kinds of fears and various kinds of phobias, you know, and in our kind of our dream life, we're continuing to process those experiences and to work with them. And also, I believe that in the dream state, where kind of there's information and data leaching through and leaking through from parallel lives we're leading at the same time. And that's therefore you're going to find yourself in situations that you don't really recognize, but is raising fears of various kinds for you. And it is a parallel part of the soul, which you know as Andrea, and we know as Andrea as we look at you, but in fact is much bigger than Andrea. And it is the parallel lifetimes and the cross-fertilization and the parallel processing that this soul has signed up for in order to hasten its evolutionary trajectory. So sometimes it's coming from stuff that we experience in this incarnation that we can identify, and fears on the basis of insults and vicissitude that we've experienced. And some of it is that we're learning from parallel lifetimes ourselves. So the question coming from Francie and from Karen was about a discussion they had during lunch today of both having experiences of walking into a historical site and turning around a corner and suddenly being kind of confronted with this experience. And the question was then, is that, you know, experience from parallel lifetimes or a time warp of some kind? You know, what's creating that, or is it downloading from the Akashic records? And the truth is, it's from both and others as well. That you can't. We know from science that you can't destroy matter. You can change its state. You can change it from a solid to a liquid to a gas to a plasma, but you can't destroy it. So you can't destroy even matter, and you certainly can't destroy energy. You know, one of the basic laws of science is that, you know, energy cannot be created or destroyed. That there's a kind of a specific amount of energy in this universe of ours from the Big Bang, and that it can never increase or decrease. It can just change form of various kinds. And so any encounter, we're basically energetic beings. When you take us down to the physiology of it being an incarnated entity. So if you look beyond the organism and you go down to the specific organs, and then you go down to the cells, and then you take the molecular structure of a cell, and then you take the kind of the atomic structure of a molecule, and then you take the kind of the subatomic particles of an atom, and then you look at the protons and the various parts of it, and you look right down to the kind of the quarks at the basis of it. No matter how far down you go, you wind up with energy. And this was Einstein's very famous formula, E equals mc squared. That energy is mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. And that ultimately, the ultimate reduction in the scientific method is the realization that there is only energy of various kinds. And so that energy is eternal and cannot be destroyed. And so we're energetic beings who constantly, by what we think, by what we say, and by what we do, are kind of propagating energy out into the cosmos. And it's intermingling with the energy of all the other systems. So we have to be very, very careful then of what kind of energies we put out, because even secret thoughts are emanating energy. And that's the great teaching of Buddhism, what they call the tulpa. A tulpa is an energy form consisting of thoughts that we have. And it's hanging either like a halo around my head, or it's hanging like a black cloud over my head, depending on the quality of the thoughts that I'm generating. And then there are neighborhood tulpas. A group gets together, and the group is creating some kind of an energetic complex. And it can be an aura for the group, or it can be a dark cloud for the group. So we're constantly beaming energy at each other. And so the energy of a historical site where something of significance happened, whether it was, you know, a battle during the Civil War in our own country or whatever it was, or the crucifixion of Jesus 2,000 years ago, that literally the kind of the location, the physical location is saturated with the energy of that encounter. And that when you get into an altered state of consciousness, you sense that and you're in contact with it. And then some people actually have the ability, the intuitive capacity to actually bring it into a sensory perception of it, to see things or hear things or feel stuff. And so it's not just that there's a kind of an amorphous energy that you encounter, but that you actually can engage your sensorium in interacting with that. And now all of those energy forms, wherever they reside kind of geographically, are all part as well of the Akashic records. So there's two ways of accessing it. You can go to, just take a wild example, let's say a battle of the American Revolution under George Washington, and you visit a site, and then you're in contact with the energy impregnated into the very soil of the location. Or you can go straight to the Akashic records and you can download the same information from it. So there are many ways of actually contacting those data. The question was this, that, if we experience life in a particular spacesuit, is it confusing in some way to try to then go into past life experiences and kind of have experiences in a totally different spacesuit, where there's a change of gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, IQ level, religious affiliation, geographical location? Isn't it confusing? I would say, on the contrary, it is really helpful. It's for instance, if you want to like study human history, it would well help you to visit different parts of the world, and not just to be stuck at a computer, in your home place, but to actually visit the locales, and to absorb the energy of the places that you visit. And so having many, many different spacesuits mean that you've had many different opportunities for the same soul self to encounter incarnation and life on this 3D density level. So that you're having multiple opportunities to kind of to fish in the ocean of reality. It's like when you go to the ocean and you're fishing, the kind of fish you're going to catch is dependent upon, depending what you're using, depending on the tine of the net you're using. If you throw a net into the ocean and the tines are 1 foot square, you're not going to catch minnows. Yeah. You may catch a dolphin, but you're not going to catch a minnow. And so the equipment you use to fish is going to determine not what fish are in the ocean, but what fish your bait is able to catch. So the instrument you're using for your experience is the limiting factor on what you're actually able to experience. So if you've got a different array of baits and different kinds of nets, you're going to kind of harvest and fish out a whole bunch of different kinds of fish. If you only had one line with one kind of bait, you're only going to catch one kind of fish. So the ability to experience incarnation in a multiplicity of spacesuits means that the soul self is getting many, many opportunities to fish in the ocean of incarnation. So Michelle's question is a very practical one. When I encountered my soul pod, why were they in positions around the clock? Why was that configuration set up? It's an artificial device, simply to try to help you focus on who's present, and is there any kind of significance to the arrangement in which they present themselves? So Matt used this for me because that's what he learned in the LBL modality. So kind of when you encounter a group, at the other side, can you create some kind of a configuration which allows you to be able to interact with everybody? So I had everybody in front of me except one person. Eamon was behind me, but I could immediately engage with everybody ahead of me. But somehow I was still aware that Eamon Hayden, my spiritual director, was behind me. But it allowed me to kind of to situate the entire group, and then to begin to see that there was actually a mathematical significance in the actual arrangement, that the two bookends were my great-grandmother and my grandfather, who represented complementary aspects, the mystical devotee who was intensely Catholic during her entire lifetime, but was a total mystic in spite of, rather than because of, her Catholic upbringing, but who is now in a different religious system, mining that system, not for its fundamentalist dogma, but for its core mysticism. So she represents that bookend. And my grandfather represented the person who stood up always for the underdog, who was a druid kind of a character, who stepped outside of formal religion. He actually got excommunicated twice during his life, as my grandfather. Literally excommunicated twice. He got excommunicated as a young man because he was involved with the Irish freedom struggle. And the bishops, in their wisdom, always taking the side of the kind of the top dog, excommunicated anybody who was fighting for Irish freedom. So he was excommunicated as a young man. That was lifted after Irish got its independence, and now the bishops suddenly got a change of mind, and now the guys who got the independence are the good guys. So the excommunication is lifted. But there was still a total ban in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics. So my grandfather was, he was a plater. So he was trained to fabricate shovels and spades and all kinds of agricultural instruments. And he was working in a foundry in this huge big furnace, literally hammering out with this huge big mechanical hammer, hammering out various agricultural implements. And he's stripped to his weight and he's sweating like a dog during this time. And a friend of his who worked in the same location, a guy called Matty Porteous, was a Protestant, and Matty died. And it was completely verboten for a Catholic to attend any service in a Protestant church or to go inside a Protestant church. And so here's his great friend being buried, and all of the other members of the foundry are standing outside the wall of the Protestant church. They can't even go inside the grounds of the Protestant church. And my grandfather goes inside, goes to the service, and has the kind of the honor of shouldering the coffin. It's a big privilege in Ireland when you're asked by a family to shoulder the coffin of somebody deceased. And he's asked to shoulder the coffin for his friend Matty Porteous. So the funeral's over, and a few days later, the local parish priest, a guy called Canon McCarthy, rides down on horseback to the foundry where my grandfather's working, and he bends down, he puts his head into this big dark hole, this hellish hole, and my grandfather's inside, stripped to the waist, sweating and making shovels. And my grandfather's name was James Murphy. And the priest said to him, James Murphy, I have a message for you. When you and I die, we're going to be going to different places. And my grandfather said to him, Canon McCarthy, that's a great relief to me to hear that. So he got excommunicated the second time for that. Yeah. So he represented another bookend. So there was like, the positioning was so important. You know, the kind of the great grandmother figure and the grandfather figure. And then dead straight ahead of me was my soulmate. And so in some senses, there was a mathematical correlation that the positioning actually was really significant. So Stefan's question was, what about my excommunication and when is that going to be lifted? It's interesting. On the Feast of St. Francis, which is October the 4th in 2010, I get a letter, a 2-page letter in Latin from the Vatican telling me that they no longer required my services, that I could no longer represent myself as a Catholic priest, that I had no permission to ever teach again in any Catholic institute, not a primary school, not a high school, and not a college, not a seminary. And that the only way in which I could exercise my priesthood is that if I found somebody dying at the side of the road and there was no real priest there to hear his confession and to shrive him, I could step in and do it on their behalf. But that otherwise my name has been struck off the register. So that was the 4th of October, 2010. On the 10th of November, 2010, my mother died. And I got a heads up from the family that she was going downhill really quickly. So I fly back to Ireland and I arrive. I spend the last 49 hours of her life with her. And then 3 days later, we have a funeral service. And now I'm saying Mass in the very, very same church that I said my first Mass in on the 4th of June in 1972, in the exact same church. And there are several of my fellow priests from the missionary organization to which I belonged at that stage who can celebrate Mass with me. But I'm thinking, you know, in the Catholic system, when there's a big, big book, the baptismal book, when you're baptized, your name is recorded as being baptized. When you get confirmed, when you make your first communion 7 years later, it's recorded in the same book. Even if you get first communion in a different parish, they have to contact the parish you were baptized in and record the fact he's received first communion. When you receive confirmation, they have to contact the same parish the guy's being confirmed. If you get married, they tell you the same book, he got married. If you got ordained instead, they record he's gotten ordained. Now I'm kind of thrown out. They have to get the Vatican gets back to them and tells them, strike him off the register. He's no longer a Catholic priest. So I go out on the altar on the, my mother died on the 10th of November. So we're burying her about the 14th of November, surrounded by these priest friends of mine. and I'm celebrating my mother's funeral service, and I'm thinking, any minute now, the local parish priest is going to examine the books and run up to you and say, "What the hell are you doing on the altar? You better get the hell out of here." And I'm literally going through the entire mass, just waiting for the sacristy door to open and some dude to come out and pull me off the altar. Yeah. So I still hadn't told my family about it. So then we had a whole series of home masses. Every time I went home from Africa or from the States, I do masses in my home for my family, extended family, and for the neighbors. And so we had a big mass at my brother's house, Seamus's house. And in the mass, I told him, what had happened, that I was being dismissed by the Vatican. And everybody started clapping. I came back to Palo Alto, and about 2 Sundays later at the SDA church in Palo Alto, and some of you guys were there, and I said what happened, and the whole church started clapping. Yeah. And so in some senses, 2 things happened. I found out that every time that I've had a kind of a disaster happen in my life, that something really, really great came out of it. That getting kicked out of Kenya, which I would say was the most unhappy day of my life, resulted in my meeting my soulmate in Palo Alto, 9,000 miles away. And that getting kicked out of, I had previously been kicked out of the Diocese of San Jose because of my talking about women priests and about reincarnation. And so I got thrown out of that, I think about 1990, was it 95, 96. And now I'm being thrown out by the Vatican. But every time I got thrown out of some place, I found out I'm more and more free. I know there's nobody kind of dictating to me, telling me what I can think, what I can say, what I can read. And I'm free to listen to spirit insofar as I can listen to spirit, and say what I believe to be the truth. And so that dismissal is never going to be lifted, Stefan. Sorry, it's for keeps this time. So Roger has just given a brilliant lecture here. I love it. And I admire Roger a lot. So this notion, there are some souls who are so kind of stuck in the darkness that they can't be extricated, nor do they want to be extricated from that. And he added a second writer about a parable of Jesus Christ talking about sowing the seed, various kinds. So let me just focus on those 2 pieces, Roger. Yeah. And so I don't believe that there's any soul that volunteers to be separated from source as a final kind of a configuration or destination. What I do think is that the souls that tend to find themselves in situations that they're completely separated from and have no interest in waking up are actually discombobulated entities, that they're souls who volunteered for reincarnation, but then during incarnation, they either made Faustian agreements with darker forces that in return for, being kind of workers on behalf of darkness, that they get to be, get the resources of the world or the riches of the world or whatever. And that in senses, they sell their souls. Now, you can't sell your soul eternally. There's a time stamp on all these things, but it can go on for a long, long time in earth measures. And that these are people that came in, like the rest of us, to try to grow and learn, and then made Faustian agreements and made constant choices for selfishness. So again, when we're born at the narcissistic end of the spectrum. Every little baby needs to be a narcissist to survive infancy. But then we're supposed to move along the spectrum from service to self at one end to service to others at the other end of it. And at some stage in our lives, to cross the 50% mark, so that we become kind of Mother Teresa's, interested in other people. But if we continue making choices for service to self, then we grow in darkness and we create this extraordinary dark tulpa around ourselves. And then we live our life. And then to make matters worse, if we do indeed make a conscious Faustian kind of agreement in some way with dark entities, that when those souls actually die at the end of an incarnation, they have no interest in finding the light. They're discombobulated and they hang around the locations of their demise, and they try to actually inhabit other individuals in order to satiate and satisfy whatever addictions they have, whether it's addiction to substances or to power. And there's a great book, one of the first books I ever read on reincarnation, called Return from Tomorrow by George Ritchie. If you've heard of that one. George Ritchie was a young man, about 19, that got conscripted towards the end of World War II into the American Armed Forces. And he's in a training camp, I believe, somewhere in Texas. And an extraordinary epidemic broke out. And George Ritchie, this young man, died. And he's covered, it's called Return from Tomorrow. He's covered with a sheet in the morgue. And he's in the morgue for several hours. And then somebody comes in and they notice that over his nostrils, that the sheet is moving up and down. And he whips it back and the kid is still alive. And he reported what his experiences were during the time he had this out-of-body encounter. And what he said was, he found himself in what we would call in Ireland a bar, a drinking tavern, and there's sawdust on the floor, and it's populated with all of these kind of servicemen, Navy people and Air Force people and Army people and whatever, and they're all drinking. They're all going to be sent off to war, and so they're kind of drinking. And he says, there are two kinds of beings in this bar. Some of them have no auras. There's literally no aura on them. They're like just dark figures, and others have auras. And he said, obviously, the ones with the auras are living entities, and the others are discombobulated entities who've already died, and they're trying to occupy a living, spacesuit. And he said, I watched, there was this young soldier going across the road with 2 pints in his hand, and the floor was slippery. He fell, and he banged his head off the ground, and for a moment, his aura just shrank to nothingness, and immediately, one of the dark forces leapt in through the top of his head and took up occupancy of the spacesuit. And so there's a lot of evidence that these are souls that are actually discombobulated, that came down here with the intention, like the rest of us, of growing, but didn't for the reasons I've mentioned. And now they're addicted to life on planet Earth. So now they're going to hang around specific locations as ghosts, kind of trying desperately to recover who they had been. Or they're addicted entities who can only satisfy their addiction by having a physical kind of expression. And that's so that they're trying to take up occupancy in a living spacesuit in order to indulge the addiction. And so even those beings, I believe at some stage that there are healers and entities at the other side who have literally infinite patience and are prepared to hang out in those kind of astral realms, because in the Hindu teaching, there are 2 levels to the astral plane. There is the lower astral plane, which is populated by disincarnate entities who are still attached to planet Earth, and then the higher astral planes, which are populated by angelic entities. So it's a very dangerous journey to take. When you travel at night into the astral realms in your dream stage, it's like going through the asteroid belt. If you're trying to go from here to Mars, you send a kind of a spaceship up there. It could be blown out of it by a little projectile just the size of a marble, traveling at huge speeds. And so that you have to be really, really careful where you're traveling your dreams. So I have a practice that I've had for years and years and years. Before I go to sleep at night, I say, I am now going to sleep. I want to visit in the astral realms with healers and teachers who can heal me and teach me. And I want to be of service to those discombobulated souls that I can help. But don't get me into doo-doo that I can't handle. Make sure I don't get myself in a situation that are way beyond my ability level. But I want to try to travel and help out. But I think there are angelic beings and healers at the other side of the veil whose specific function and ministry is to hang around those discombobulated entities as long as it's going to take, until finally there's a little splink of light available for these entities, and that they finally turn to the light and realize there's a place beyond the darkness in which they find themselves. So there's a movie that Raven Dean recommended, a Pixar movie called Soul, which deals precisely with the thing I've just been talking about the ministrations to the discombobulated entities. Ingrid has been talking about the ability of any soul being committed to the healing, not just of the self, but of the entire family lineage, going backwards and forwards. In fact, I did a series of homilies on that about a few years ago. That part of our function is not just about selfishly trying to kind of heal our own hurt or deal with our own particular trauma, but that we're in a lineage, and that any person at any stage of a lineage can, for instance, stop an addictive tendency in the family system or an abuse in the family system, and that we can retroactively actually heal the woundedness and the darkness that has been visited upon the entire family system, and do that retroactively. given that there is no such thing as time at the other side. So that's a hugely important ministry, Ingrid. Thank you for raising that. That is very important ministry, even during incarnation, is the ability to affect not just the immediate family who are still alive and are kind of impressionable, but to the entire lineage, going backwards in time and going forwards in time, so that we become a kind of a healing force, that permeates the entire family dynamic. So you're absolutely right. And so every field is fraught with fraudulence. So every profession you can think of, from priesthood to psychology to politicians to economists. And so every field is subject to fraudulence and to malinformation and misinformation and disinformation. So you have to be really careful, as you say, to really access the sources whom you can trust. And part of it is to kind of cross-fertilize sources and find out, what really appeals to your spirit. What sources actually grow you rather than make you feel fearful. So anything that's going to create anxiety or fear in you, I would say stay away from it. It's not of God. Anything of God is going to light you up. Now, the really great teacher is not the person who can give you information that you didn't previously have. That's not a great teacher. The great teacher is somebody who can roll back your amnesia for what you already know. And this is the greatness of Christ, particularly in his use of parables. The reason he's using parables is that he's trying to help people to roll back the amnesia so they get the aha experience. And this again was the Socratic method, that Socrates would ask questions that allow people to come up with their own answers. And in fact, when you look at the Latin roots of the word education, in Latin it is educatio, and educatio in Latin means to lead out from inside of. Is out of, duc is to lead. So real education is leading out from inside. So unfortunately, our school systems regard children as empty vessels to be filled up with data, and information pieces, rather than indulging the extraordinary creativity and imagination that children naturally come in with. And again, many times I've defined the difference between imagination and fantasy. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to spontaneously and intentionally alter my state of consciousness, enter into different realms and dimensions, interact with energies and entities that reside in those different dimensions, talk with them, learn from them, cross-fertilize with them, and then bring that energy back into waking consciousness and kind of impregnate my personal cosmology with those data or with that information. So a great teacher is not somebody who tells you stuff that you didn't know. Great teacher helps you remember what you already know. So go to sources, and when you have an aha experience that makes sense to you, and that sets your heart to fire, realize then you've reached a source that can be depended upon. So Denise's question was, who is Lauren? The Lauren that I keep mentioning in this account. Lauren, to put it very briefly, and then I'll give you kind of background to it. Lauren is my guardian angel. So Lauren is the being that prepared me for many incarnations and kind of debriefed me at the end of these incarnations. So somebody mentioned this morning, they thought when I was talking about my soulmate, Ireland, I was talking about Ireland. And one thing I realized is that Ireland and Lauren, they're almost the same word. They all have A, R, L, and N in them. So that's not just a happenstance or a synchronicity or. So the story behind Lauren is this. I was saying Mass in a church in Palo Alto called St. Thomas Aquinas Church. If those of you who know Palo Alto, it's a little black and white wooden church. And I was saying Mass, and at the end of Mass, I went back into the sacristy to take off my vestments. And a woman who was a parishioner, whom I actually knew, came into the sacristy, and she said, "Do you know who your guardian angel is?" What do you mean? I said, "I don't." She said, "Your guardian angel is called Lauren." And then she turned around and walked out. Okay. So, I say Mass in the morning, and then at 9 o'clock, I put on my psychologist hat, and I'm seeing clients all day. So I go to my office, which was in Los Altos, And I pick a book off the shelf. We shared an office with a guy called Michael Priddy, and his library was there. And when I'm waiting for my first client, I pick a book off the shelf and I flick through it and I open it up. And the first word on the left-hand side at the top of the page was the word Lauren. Okay, so, okay. This is not just a kind of a coincidence. This is a synchronicity. So, okay. And so thereafter, I always knew I did guardian angel. So now I'm going to give the guardian angel a name. I'm going to call her Lauren, and so that's kind of the etymology of who Lauren is. Yeah, I kept mentioning her. Yeah, I did. I just mentioned the name Lauren a few times. I wasn't more specific, except that Lauren was the mentor who took me to the healing location, and will appear again a little bit subsequently, as I find myself in different locations. I'll talk about those tomorrow. Susie's question is, do I sense Lauren in this incarnation? Absolutely. I talk to her every day, many times during the day. Yeah, many, many times during the day. And I call her out by name, and kind of ask for guidance, and particularly around my dream life. Like this, here's I want input about X or Y or Z or whatever. Yeah, so we have a regular exchange. Bill's question was, if I hadn't been told beforehand that Lauren was the name of my guardian angel, would I have discovered it in the session? Now, it's interesting, when you read through Michael Newton's work, and he's written 3 books that I've read at least. The first one is called Journey of Souls, the second one is called Destiny of Souls, and then the third one, which is written basically for kind of people who are going to learn how to use LBL in a therapeutic sense. One of the questions he will sometimes ask is, can you name your mentor? And mostly they will. Yeah. So Matt didn't ask me that question, but he didn't have to, because I volunteered it at some stage of the thing. I think I've mentioned it already in 1 or 2 sessions that I mentioned that my mentor at the other side, so he didn't need to ask me that question. Francine's question has to do with the use of the term frequency, and that the impression given is that the higher the frequency, the more evolved the person is, or the more important the experience is, whereas lower frequencies are seen as down. In actual fact, so there's obviously mathematical and quantum mechanical notions of what frequency consists of, and frequency is kind of the periodicity, the kind of the number of cycles per second, is basic measure of frequency. But in actual fact, they talk about 4 basic kinds of frequency. So alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And that often beta is a very high frequency, and typically it's regarded as a frequency of 12 or more cycles per second. Alpha is a little bit down from that, and alpha is like from 8 to 12 typically, cycles per second. So beta is when you're actually really, really busy. And so your instinct is absolutely right. When you're really, really busy and your frequency is up in the kind of the beta range, you may be productive externally, but you're not being productive internally. So alpha is lower, from about 8 to 12. And then there's theta, which typically is between 4 and 8 cycles per second. And that's when you're in dream sleep. And then delta is where you're is 0 to 4 cycles per second. And at that stage, there's a very, very low frequency and you're in deep dreamless sleep. And so very, very often, just as you experience, that the greatest experiences happen with the lower frequencies. But then when you kind of you maximize it and go into like frequencies of 432 hertz or 548 hertz, or you take the kind of the resonance of the planet itself, at that stage, there are higher harmonics of lower frequencies. So harmonics becomes a very important element as well. So there are some very high frequencies, like the planet itself has a frequency, but the frequency of the planet is determined by the distance from the equator. And so you can estimate at any location what song the planet is singing, literally by knowing your geographical location and your distance from the equator. You know exactly what frequency the planet is vibrating at that location. So harmonics are very important then. So it's not so much the kind of the basic frequency per se, but the different harmonics of those basic frequencies. But when you're asleep at night and not dreaming, you're in the lowest actually frequency, and that's when a lot of great stuff tends to happen. You're on the other side then. You have kind of superseded all kinds of consciousness and you're at source. So there's no perturbation necessary. But what we find then is that different frequencies, you have radically different effects on physical matter. So there's a whole science called cymatics, where we come across that, where you can vibrate like a medium like water or sand, and depending on the frequency to which you expose it, like an acoustical frequency, these extraordinary designs happen on the surface of the water or the surface of sand, and with their higher frequencies. And so again, it depends on harmonics. And of the work of Emoto, the great Japanese kind of experimenter, who would literally just write words on bottles of water, or labels on bottles of water, or else play music of various kinds. And then he would freeze them and watch the crystallization process of the water. And water which had been subjected to kind of discordant sounds, really discordant kind of cacophony. The crystallization process looked really, really yucky. And that was exposed, for instance, to Tchaikovsky or something like that. The crystallization process was just extraordinary. Now, given the fact that we're 80% water, that therefore the acoustical vibrations in which we live have a huge effect on our physical health, on literally our well-being, and the well-being of every organ within the body and of the organism per se. And the very same thing is true of the mind. Then a mind, or even a physical brain that's exposed to different kinds of frequencies, are going to kind of respond in various different ways, from kind of having a headache and wanting to cover my ears to just being blissed out by the sounds I'm experiencing. And part of what's been reported by the near-death experience people is that on the other side, that they're kind of exposed to a kind of music they've never experienced on planet Earth. That literally it's a living music. And the interesting thing is that the music is not emanating from a saxophone someplace or a kind of a piano someplace. It's emanating from every leaf on every tree and every blade of grass and every lawn. That everything that they experience on the other side is literally creating music, a music that just totally harmonizes with the vibrancy of the soul. And one final thing I would say about it is that in the afterlife, we're going to be attracted to the frequencies that kind of resonate with our own frequency. And therefore, in the various realms, in the infinite number of realms at the other side, we're going to be instinctively drawn to the vibrancy and the periodicity and the synchrony of particular kinds of resonances. And so it's not that God is keeping anybody out of heaven or sending anybody to hell. It is that we're going to be attracted to some place that resonates with our own frequency. And for some people, that's darkness and separation from source, continued separation. And for other people, it's kind of union with source. So it's not being determined by a punitive God with a ledger in looking at the kind of the mistakes you've made or the sins you've committed. It is that you're in such a place at your soul level that you're instinctively drawn. This is the kind of music I want to be subjected to, or this is the kind of light that I want to experience. And so that judgment on the other side is always self-imposed. And the decision for location on the other side and the decision for community on the other side is created completely by the soul who's just moved across. Shelley's question is either my own case or a case of other people, particularly those kind of died violently. Is there a need to go to some kind of a healing place at the other side, as part of the kind of the journey of either the near-death experience or the kind of afterlife or the bardo state? Is it necessary to go into such a healing spot? And the very simple answer is yes. And in actual fact, tomorrow I'm going to talk about what my experience in that was. So depending upon the mode of exit from a particular incarnation, different kind of healing modalities or healing centers are called upon. So again, I'm going to crave your indulgence, Shelley, because I deal with that tomorrow. It's part of the experience I had. So Robert's question had to do with, he's reading a book. The last book I wrote was called Setting God Free, Moving Beyond the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Image. And so it was published a few years ago. And then my good friend, John Euland, spent a lot of time and a lot of energy coming up to my house on many occasions with all his sound equipment and making an audible version of it, which we finished last year, which is available at this stage. And so basically what I was doing, I was this is Robert's question, how do I kind of distinguish between this God that appears in kind of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, and the difference between that and the God that we learn about in the teachings of Jesus. So what is the difference? So will I spoil the ending of the book for you if I tell you the answer? Okay. So the truth is, I came to 2 very important conclusions at the end of it. And my publisher kept one of the conclusions out of the finished version because she felt that the book was too long at that stage. And so I had the presentation of the book is that I had a trial in which I set God in in the dock for crimes against humanity. And so I had a prosecutor and I had a defense attorney, and each of them called in expert witnesses, archaeologists, biblical scholars, psychologists, contract lawyers, Jungian analysts. So they're arrayed at both sides of this, and there's a whole prosecution and a whole defense of God. And then there's a summation and a decision by the judge. And the first and most important conclusion I came to was that this God, that we have feared, is a projection of the human shadow. So if you're familiar with the work of Carl Jung, you realize that projection is the phenomenon whereby can we project onto other people our own particular darkness. And if we do that as individuals, we create interpersonal conflict. And if we do this as communities, we create group prejudices. And if we do this as a Homo sapiens sapiens, we create a battle with nature, and we see nature as just a resource. And so after engaging all of these experts, the decision by the judge was that the wrong person was on trial, that God had done none of these things, that these were literally if you wanted, the tulpa, the community tulpa, of the darkness of the times that people in their lived experience, they were living at a time and a period when there was just one empire after the other conquering each other. So beginning with the Akkadian culture, way back like 6000 BCE, and then they're overcome by the Babylonian Empire, and the Babylonians are overcome by the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians are overcome again by the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are overcome by the Persians, and the Persians are overcome by the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are overcome by the Greeks, and the Greeks are overcome by the Romans, and the Romans are overcome by the Portuguese, and the Portuguese are overcome by the Spaniards, and the Spaniards are overcome by the English, and finally America overcomes them all. And so we got this revolving colonialism throughout the world. And what I've seen in my historical review is that there's a kind of, I see a bunch of megalomaniacs, incarnating again and again in the planet, and that this movement towards oligarchy and colonialism is moving constantly in a Western direction. And it's literally come from, if you want to look at ancient China, and then Genghis Khan, in Mongolia, and then the groups I've just mentioned in the Middle East, Acadia, Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, Portugal, Spain, England, the United States of America, and now back again to China. So it's like this elite is circumambulating the globe and visiting their colonialist agenda on us. And sometimes it's a military conquest, and sometimes it's just literally the abrogation of civil rights of various kinds and the censorship level of various kinds. There are many ways of colonizing people. You can do it economically, you can do it militarily, you can do it through education, you can do it by the depressing a culture, getting rid of a language. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 7,000 languages on the planet. By the end of the 20th century, there were only 5,000 languages left on the planet. And so there's lots of ways of being a colonialist and imposing a new system. So the conclusion I came to then was that there's a mass projection happening here. So people who lived under the jackboot of so many different colonialist regimes are they want a God who can protect them from their enemies. So they invent this story. It's not a true story. There was no character called Moses. Moses never appears in non-Jewish literature until the Greeks invaded in the year 333 under Alexander the Great. He's never mentioned. He's picked up by the Greeks from Hebrew stories. So there's zero evidence in Egypt who were fastidious record keepers. There is no history whatsoever of a group in Egypt that escaped en masse, about 2 million people. If you read the biblical account, there were 650,000 escaped slaves, and they're only counting the men of military age. So if there are 650,000 military-aged men, what about the older men and the younger men, and then all the women? So you're talking about a group of maybe 2 million people. So we're led to believe that 2 million people spent 40 years in the Sinai Desert, which was totally controlled by Egypt at that stage. Egypt controlled everything up to Turkey in the north, and Persia in the east. And that somehow 2 million people wandered around the desert for 40 years, and the Egyptians didn't notice. And the archaeological evidence shows that there's zero evidence for such a thing. So what happened is you got a group of nomadic Canaanite people around at some stage around about 1100 BCE, who make war on settled Canaanite cities. And they band together, these nomadic groups band together, and they destroy the settled cities of Canaan at that stage. And when you look at the archaeological evidence, the only difference between the tribes that we think are Israelites and the Canaanites is the absence of pig bones at Israelite sites. Everything else is identical. The pottery, the artifacts are completely the same. And so there were a Canaanite group who were nomadic, who attacked Canaanite groups who were urbanized. And so, but now when the Bible is actually being written, which is about the years 550 BCE, they're living in a situation where the 10 northern tribes have been destroyed by the Assyrian Empire in the year 722 BCE, and there's only 2 tribes left, Judah and Benjamin, and now they've been deported to Babylon, and now they're fearful this is the end of the line, we're going to be wiped out completely. And this is something that Judaism, unfortunately, has had to face again and again and again and again, the threat of being wiped out completely off the face of the earth. And so the priests get together and they create a mythology. And all cultures create origin myths to explain where we came from, how special we are, and how we're going to survive present vicissitude into future possibilities. And so they create these scriptural traditions, and they invent a character called Moses and an Exodus, because in a few years, the Persian Empire is going to overthrow the Babylonian Empire and set the last 2 tribes of Israel free to go back to the land of Israel, and they will rebuild their temple. And this is not just an act of love from the Persians to the Jews, but the Persian Empire wanted a force on their western flank to protect them against Egypt, because there's constant warfare between Persia and Egypt. And in fact, so Cyrus the Great is the emperor of Persia who set the Israelites free to go back to the land of Israel, and his son conquered Egypt and became a pharaoh himself in Egypt. And so you have to realize that here's a people who are barely hanging on by their fingernails to literally survival as a culture. So they invent all these great mythologies about this hero Moses. And so I would say that Moses is probably the greatest the greatest liberator that never lived. He has inspired so many different cultures all over the world. And that becomes really important. So when you read this story, then you have to read it through the lens of mythology. And mythology is the archived wisdom of a culture, and it consists of origin stories that tell us where we came from, and it consists of stories that tell us that we're God's chosen, we're more beloved of God than anybody else, and it consists of stories that allow us to defy present vicissitude and survive into the future. So that's the background out of which it came. And so when you read this story, then you're reading about a people who've managed to survive more than any other people in the history of the planet Earth, who've managed to survive again and again and again against overwhelming odds, efforts to totally annihilate them being. We've seen this, in the Holocaust, between 1939 and 1945. 6 million of these people totally wiped out. There was the final solution. We're going to finally wipe out these people. Now you're living in that culture. You have to create some kind of mythology that gives you the inner strength to survive that and to continue to grow. So that's part of the realization, the importance of this work, understanding what this work is. And the second one, and this is really controversial, I had written 2 other chapters to that book in which I talked about the reality for me of extraterrestrial visitation. And that at some stage, like Wave and Dean asked this morning about the Anunnaki, that we have been visited again and again and again by extraterrestrial civilizations. When you think of it, that Planet Earth is only 4.6 billion years of age. There has been life on planet Earth only for 3.7 billion years of age. There are parts of our universe which are 13.6 billion years of age. So there literally are parts of the universe which are 3 times older than planet Earth. Now, if you can imagine the extraordinary technological advances since the scientific revolution in the 1600s, and you watch where we are today in just 400 years, can you imagine the sophisticated technology of a group that's been there literally billions of years before we arrived? And they've discovered a planet that has resources that they need. We're simply a resource for them. And so I believe that various extraterrestrial groups came down to the planet and created what are now known as cargo cults. When a primitive culture meets a very technologically sophisticated culture, the primitive culture always regards the others as gods. And we saw that actually during World War II, when both Japanese and American forces landed on Micronesian islands in the Pacific, the locals regarded them as gods, and they set up shrines to them. And when the war ended and these people disappeared, they created rituals to bring back, they're called cargo cults, because these visitors brought cargo with them, all kinds of goodies. I know they're creating ceremonies to try to get these sky beings to come back down to help them. And I believe that that's precisely what happened on our planet. That many of these visitations created warring groups of gods. We call them gods. They're just basically extraterrestrial civilizations that were warring with each other for resources on planet Earth, and they occupy different parts of the planet, and they're at war with each other. And each group of people adopted a particular kind of a god. So I believe that I see that there were 3 different kinds of gods when you look at it theologically. The first group I would call regional divinities, so that when you move into a particular geographical location, now you have to pay homage to that particular god because he's in charge there. And he's going to be really upset if you're still worshiping the gods of the place you just left. It's going to be problems for you. And that's why the Romans were really, really hell-bent on honoring the local gods of the countries they conquered and wanting people to continue to honor their local gods. So the first kind of gods I would call regional divinities. They're in charge of specific geographical locations. The second kind of gods I call tribal divinities. And these were gods that attached themselves to particular peoples. And if the peoples migrated, if they were nomadic, the gods moved around with them. So it's the second kind of god. And the third god I would call portfolio divinities. And these were gods who had a speciality. If you're interested in agriculture, here's the guy you need to worship. If you're interested in warfare, here's the guy that you're going to worship. If you're interested in art, here's the guy you need to worship. And so we got these 3 totally different kinds of gods. And they're all warring with each other. And human beings are caught up as in proxy wars, literally proxy wars, where we're forced to fight for these different, extraterrestrial dimensions. So I did a whole section on the book on that. But I was advised by the publisher that the book was too long, put it into an appendix. So I put it into an appendix. And then the final decision was, even as an appendix, it's slightly off key. It's not exactly the same thing as putting God on trial. So we need to chop it off. So I chopped it off. In the meantime, I befriended a man in Australia called Paul Wallace, who's written 4 brilliant books on this. It's called the Eden series, where he takes this up very, very seriously. And Paul and I have done actually joint interviews together with Regina Meredith on Gaia TV, looking at, what the effect of extraterrestrial entities have had on human religions. And Paul who's a really good hermeneutic scholar, which hermeneutics is the science of unscrambling or exegeting ancient texts, biblical texts in particularly, and looking at the etymology of the words being used. And the interesting thing is that the word God is never used in the Old Testament. There are particular terms that have been interpreted into Greek and into Latin, into English as God, but the original terms are not God. The original terms are either Yahweh, which is a kind of a title, or Elohim, which means the powerful ones, plural. And so there is no evidence whatsoever in the early Hebrew scriptures that they're promoting an eternal, omniscient, physical being. There's zero evidence for it. But it's been hidden in the translations. And when you go back to the originals and you unpack the originals, it's very definitely treating of And you can see the progression within the scriptures themselves of a movement from these individual extraterrestrial entities who are colonizing and exacting tremendous prices into some kind of a belief in a loving divinity. So unfortunately, we borrowed the same thing in Christianity. We've turned the teachings of Jesus, of this loving Father, into a kind of a distant, demanding deity at best. And we've even turned Jesus into a judge, separating the sheep from the goats. And so there is no religious tradition which hasn't fallen prey to turning God into some kind of a pathological villain. You find it all over in all the traditions. Mauro Biglino, he's an Italian scholar who was commissioned by the Catholic Church to do many of the biblical translations from the most ancient manuscripts available, to translate them into Latin and other languages. And he's a huge protagonist. He's showing there is no mention of God in the Hebrew scriptures, not God in the sense in which we typically think about some kind of an omniscient, eternal being who's totally outside of human affairs. You know, the beings that are spoken of and the terms that are used, some of them, you know, there is no etymological origin from the word Yahweh. There is no way possibly of knowing what that actually meant. It may have been a title. So many of the other titles like El Shaddai, you know, and Elohim, they have much more kind of mundane explanations and interpretation. So this guy Mauro he was a scholar that was commissioned by the Catholic Church to do many of those translations, and came to the very same conclusions. And I've seen interviews between himself and Paul Wallace kind of talking about this issue as well. So John's question had to do with something that I covered in the morning lecture of the battlefield, the scene at the battlefield when so many soldiers have been killed and we're transitioning, and there's this mayhem. There's all the explosions and the kind of the noise and the bombing that's going on underneath. And there's the fear and the anxiety, you know, of the disincarnated souls, those who have just been kind of propelled through death. And what is the kind of process that's involved in getting them to kind of readjust their cosmology or the belief system? So obviously it depends from individual to individual. Each person is going to experience the transition in a unique fashion. And depending on the kind of the familiarity of the incarnated person with the dying process and their own spirituality, the level of evolution of the soul, they're going to experience the transition in very different ways. So there are some souls who are absolutely scared. They can't understand what's happening, you know, and they're really angry. And at this stage now, they're seeing a whole bunch of other people and they're identifying, they're the guys who killed us, you know, whether you're Russians or German, they're the guys who killed us. And now here we're hanging out together somehow. So it didn't make sense to them. So they're filled with fear. And so at that stage, I recognize that there are 3 other members who got the same understanding that I have, that this was a dream that just ended. And that our job is to somehow, you know, take pity of and take control of the dynamic that's happening here, and somehow awaken all of the other soldiers to the reality, you know, of what they're going through. And so, although 2 of the others are in German uniforms, and I'm in a Russian uniform, and I'm a private in the army. I have no rank whatsoever in the army, but that I have the rank of awareness. That it's awareness that bestows rank, not kind of stripes on my arm or whatever. And that those of us who've remembered that we've done this before are now going to kind of compassionately take control of the situation, you know, and try to deal with the fear and the anxiety and the anger that they're experiencing. Now, it's still kind of in army format, and so they're still used to taking orders from somebody. And so somebody with some level of kind of authority is going to take charge of the situation. And at that stage, the stripes on the shoulder are not significant. But those people, 4 of us in this case, who seem to be speaking with some kind of authority, you know, they're the guys to listen to. You know, at this stage, we're not going to look at, you know, who's a corporal here, who's a sergeant here, who's a captain here, whatever. These are guys who seem to know what they're about. So listen to what they have to say. And so at this stage, we're initially then treating them as an army. We need guys, we need to move out of here. You know, hovering over this scenario of noise and gunfire and bombs, whatever, That's not good for the soul right now. We need to move out of there. So I moved them out of that state. And then saying, but now we don't need to operate as an army anymore. We're not going to be marching in formation to the next stage. Every single one of you is a soul that volunteered to be here. And you volunteered to engage in a drama, that ended in a very dramatic fashion for you. But it was a drama. It was a dream. The dream is over, guys. You're soul beings who volunteered for incarnation. So now each one of you is meant to look out for your mentor. There's somebody who is beckoning you, or there's some kind of a light that's attracting you. Now we're going to break ranks and formation, and each one of you is going to kind of focus on finding that person for yourself. And then every person went off, to follow their own light.